The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining our webinar focusing on the Arizona Forensic Science Training Academy. The Academy is a legal training program that is notable both for its depth and its structure. Participants attend 9 sessions that meet every other week, so it covers a lot of material. And prosecutors and criminal defense lawyers are trained together in classes taught by subject matter experts and forensics professionals. My name is Maria Beeman, and I'm a Senior Project Manager with the Justice Management Institute. JMI is a nonprofit organization that undertakes research, training, and technical assistance projects aimed at improving the administration of justice. And my colleague Amy Wickman is also on the line today. The panel you will hear from today features 4 folks from Arizona, 2 who helped develop the training and 2 who are graduates of the Academy. Before we proceed, just to get an idea of who's attending the webinar, we'd like to take a quick poll, and you'll see on your screen some choices, and if you can just select the best one that best describes your role or affiliation. And we'll just take a couple of seconds for this. Okay, a few more seconds. And Amy's going to show us the results. So, okay, great. Well, as you can see, we've got a nice mix of backgrounds, which reflects today's reality that forensic science education has become essential for all lawyers and judges to properly handle the increasing number of criminal and juvenile cases involving issues of forensic science. This webinar will discuss how the Arizona model was developed, what the curriculum encompasses, and will give you guidance on how you can adapt it to your own jurisdiction. The program is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance, and an archived copy of it will be available on JMI's website later. And we do hope to have questions, time for questions and answers, but we're going to hold those until the end of the presentation. In the meantime, feel free to suggest questions. I think you can enter them in the chat section on your screen. And now, I'm enormously pleased to introduce Judge Ron Reinstein, who will be our moderator. Judge Reinstein, among other things, is a retired Maricopa County Superior Court judge who chairs the Arizona Forensic Science Advisory Committee, and he is a judicial consultant with the Arizona Supreme Court. He's a nationally renowned DNA expert who helped develop the Forensic Science Academy. Ron, welcome, and take it away.
Thanks, Maria, and welcome to all of you who are listening in today. First, I want to thank JMI, particularly Maria Beeman and Amy Wickman, for organizing all this, and also Chris Manis from the Arizona Administrative Office of the Courts for helping us with all the technical stuff that's here in Arizona. What we're going to do today, it's not going to be a lesson on how to do DNA or anything like that. We're going to talk about what we've been able to accomplish in Arizona for the joint training of prosecutors and defense attorneys in the various forensic science disciplines. We've had quite a few inquiries from around the country and believe it's a model that can be easily replicated. For those of you familiar with the NAS report on strengthening forensic science and the recommendations therein, one of the recommendations was the education and training of prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges in all areas of forensic science. And what we're going to do today is talk to you about what we think is this unique training, joint training program where the main objective is to learn about the various forensic science disciplines. And with us today are 4 panelists, one of them being me. The other one are Marna McClendon, who is retired from the Arizona Attorney General's office as a prosecutor. Marna is kind of unique in that she has a master's in forensic science. Her career has started as a law enforcement officer in Maryland, and then she was a prosecutor there. She was the elected state's attorney in Maryland as well. Then Tim Agan has been primarily a criminal defense attorney for about 22 years. with the Legal Defender's Office in Maricopa County, and now as the Deputy Director of the Office of Legal Advocate. Tim is an experienced capital litigator, and he also served 5 years in the Arizona Attorney General's office before he started his defense career. And finally, not last but not least, is Elaine Roby with the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. She is a white-collar crime specialist. Before becoming a prosecutor, she worked as a victim advocate for the Attorney General's office. And both Tim and Elaine have gone through the basic and advanced academies, and they both are on the alumni board. And I know all three of them, just as I am, are happy to be with you today. Tim and Marna, why don't you talk a little bit about what we've heard from not only the NAS report, but also forensic scientists about education of lawyers and judges, and comments and criticisms and the like.
Thanks, Ron, and good to be here with everybody today. Well, it was in 2009, I believe, that the National Academy of Sciences report came out. And as I recall, we anticipated a lot of criticism in this area, but they were very critical in the report of a number of areas involving the comparison disciplines in forensic science. So latent fingerprints, tool mark comparisons, firearm comparisons. But they were also very critical of all practitioners in the criminal justice arena for not better identifying forensic science issues in their cases, raising them, and properly litigating them.
You know, obviously most of us went to law school because we did very poorly in the sciences. I was an English major. I think that in order to graduate as a undergrad requirement, I had to take some sort of science class, and there was like some sort of easy science class that was a combination of biology and geology that I was able to take, and I passed it. You know, obviously, as time has passed and the cases have gotten more complicated, forensic science has become more and more critical parts of the cases. It's presented in more and more different types of cases. It's becoming much more complicated in terms of what's being presented to the jurors. And it's very important for the lawyers to have an understanding of what they're dealing with. And the lawyers needed to be trained in this area so they could adequately represent their clients and tell the jurors about the evidence that they were hearing.
Tim and Elaine, with the proliferation of innocence and justice projects around the country and the impact that DNA has had on the whole justice system, are there some examples of where we all could have done better as prosecutors or defense attorneys or judges, and why training is so important in this area?
You know, obviously one of the cases that is probably known a little bit throughout the nation, has been very important in Arizona, is the case of Ray Crone, which involved forensic issues that had indicated forensic issues that had occurred in a case where Mr. Crone was accused of a crime that he did not commit. Mr. Crone was accused of a murder, which was a particularly brutal murder, which had occurred in a bar after it had closed. There were no eyewitnesses, but the person who, or the investigation centered on Mr. Crone based upon some bite mark evidence or forensic odontology. Even though DNA was presented at the earliest trial or the trials, and the DNA may have indicated that Mr. Crone was not involved in the murder, he was convicted on the bite mark evidence. Subsequently, the Innocence Project did some post-conviction DNA testing, and he was later exonerated. Obviously, this is an indication of how perhaps the forensic disciplines were not understood and not properly presented to the jury, because he was convicted upon a claim that the bite mark evidence was actually better at excluding anybody than fingerprints would be.
And just to touch upon what Tim had mentioned, I mean, the Crone case becomes incredibly important, not just from the defense perspective in that we want to make sure that the evidence that we are presenting to the jury is correct, but from a prosecutor standpoint, the reality is when prosecutors don't understand the sciences, they either end up in horrible circumstances like the Crone case, convicting somebody that's innocent, but also on the flip side, if they don't understand the forensics behind their evidence, such as DNA or ballistics, things like this, there's people that are very dangerous that are let out onto the streets. Also, from the standpoint that the general public really looks to prosecutors to uphold and administer justice, and if we don't understand what we're presenting, we lose any type of credibility we have in the public's eye.
Judge Weinstein, you also mentioned the question about what have we heard from criminalists and forensic scientists regarding education. Very clearly in our discussions for years, they have wanted lawyers and, by the way, judges to be better informed, better educated on the issues of forensic science, particularly in terms of its limitation. And sometimes lawyers haven't always been good about understanding the limitations of any expert witness, what they can say and what they really can't say.
All right. I want to talk to you how this all got started. And we started about 4 years ago under the Arizona Forensic Science Advisory Committee, which Maria said that told you that I chair. It's under the auspices of the Arizona Attorney General. It was started by Attorney General Terry Goddard. And it developed from a recommendation from a DNA committee and the cold case task force. I was appointed chair of it 4 years ago, and we meet quarterly. The Forensic Science Advisory Committee is made up of all the Arizona crime lab directors, both state and local, law enforcement members from the Department of Public Safety, the Department of Corrections, the state sheriff's offices around the state, and also local police departments. It also has prosecution representatives, defense representatives, representatives from the Arizona Justice Project, the chief medical examiner from Maricopa County, and the courts. And it's also staffed by not only the Attorney General's office, but the Arizona Criminal Justice Commission. Again, we meet quarterly. One of the things that's really been impressive is the collaboration that's been involved. We've had Supreme Court justices from Arizona attend many of our meetings. We've had guest speakers at our meeting on evidence preservation, on eyewitness identification reforms, on familiar searching, on conviction integrity, and we continue to do that. Our next meeting is going to be next month. But one of the real achievements has been the education subcommittee, and I'm going to turn it over to Marna to talk to you about how the whole issue of the academy developed.
Well, first of all, it was the first meeting, I think, of the advisory committee to the Attorney General where discussion occurred among the people at the table, including a lot of the crime lab managers as well as the lawyers, in terms of the need for training. So it was clear that although this committee may want to take on a lot of different aspects and issues, education was clearly one that was front and center. And by the way, this was before the issuance of the NAS report. So immediately after the first meeting, we formed an education committee, and I was grateful to chair that committee. And on that committee, we had a smaller subset, obviously, of the advisory council. So we had courts represented, the Arizona Criminal Justice Commission, as well as the Phoenix Police Department Crime Lab Manager and the Arizona Department of Public Safety Crime Manager. And I was the representative from the Attorney General's office. And we started discussing what we wanted to do in terms of criminal justice practitioners and training. So we thought about law enforcement officers, crime lab and criminalists, as well as prosecution, defense, and judges. So shortly after that, we started writing grants. And I know I'm not alone in saying this, but grants are hard to write. They are time-consuming, labor-intensive, and, oh, may I say, frustrating. And over the next 2 years, we attempted to obtain funds for what we thought would be great forensic science training. We would have a 2-day seminar. We would have different tracks for different professionals. We would bring in speakers from across the country and perhaps even Great Britain, but dare I say we didn't get those grants. So we had to start thinking about other ways of taking and doing the business that we needed to be doing. So we started thinking, what can we do with existing resources in place? And I think personally, I feel that sometimes we forget about this. We always look towards grants and what we might get accomplished with grant funding. But often, in terms of our own wealth of resources, we have a lot locally. So that's what we started to do, is taking stock of our existing resources. There was a model that I was focused on, which was police departments often run citizen police academies. And they've done this across the country, a lot of police departments. So I started thinking, well, why couldn't we do something similar for lawyers on forensic science? And so I approached one of the members of the Education Committee, Jody Wolf, from the Phoenix Police Department Crime Lab, and she's a manager there. And I said, do you and do the criminalists participate in the Citizen Academy, the police academy? And she said, well, yes, we do. I said, well, then what about if we tried to do something like that for lawyers? So we then, of course, contacted everybody else on the Education Committee and started thinking through what are the existing resources and couldn't we do something like this for attorneys? Well, our resources are the criminalists. They're the experts in their discipline. They're the experts that go into court, and that's where we started.
All right, Tim and Marna, one of the things that you started with is having a board for the Academy, and we selected people to be on that board. I know both of you are on the board now. Can you talk a little bit about the working of the board and the planning that's involved? Tim?
I actually was in the first Academy class and joined the board at the conclusion of that class when I was invited in as a defense bar representative. The defense bar in Arizona has been active in providing a lot of its own training through the Arizona Public Defenders Association, an organization which presents a yearly seminar. And, you know, this had dealt more with legal issues rather than the issues of the forensics training, but it was a natural for us to reach out into this area because we were able then to help assist in providing the forensic training and to make sure that it would be meaningful to people that were defense practitioners in that area.
Marna?
In terms of really the overall planning effort, it was really important to create that Academy board, and it was including the people on the Education Committee, but that wasn't sufficient. So we really had to look at who else has to be at that table to make this concept work, to even decide that this is a viable concept. So again, we had the Department of Public Safety and the Phoenix Police Department Crime Lab, but we needed a host agency in terms of physically where would we ultimately hold this academy. And fortunately, on our advisory committee is the Maricopa County Medical Examiner, who immediately stepped up and said, we have a great training facility. That's also a forensic science center, so that really just spoke volumes to what this academy could look like and feel like, and that we would have a place to meet. So that person, the medical examiner, became a member of that first academy board. We also then needed to reach out to folks that were not at that time involved in the advisory committee. The Prosecutors Association had to be involved, and in Arizona, that is the Arizona Prosecuting Attorneys Advisory Council. The executive director was contacted by me very early on and thrilled, frankly, to be involved in such a training effort. We then needed to reach out, and this was once we made a decision to include defense attorneys. We reached out and spoke with the training coordinator for the defense bar, and again, as Tim described, very excited about being involved in such an effort. So we decided we had now, these were the right people, and we always, by the way, would reflect, is there anybody else that we really need on that academy board to be successful? Continuing on with just a discussion, if we can, on a planning effort, we're going to go into a lot of detail and nuts and bolts. So rather than just a lofty discussion of why we think this was a great idea, we're going to be very specific in terms of what we needed to do, who needed to do it, in what time frame to actually get this accomplished. The first question then, and it was part of the discussion of existing resources, was who would be the faculty? Well, as I said, we had the experts. So we had to make sure that the crime labs, both Phoenix Crime Lab and the Department of Public Safety, the managers were comfortable having those criminalists be participating in this project. And then, you know, the question arose, well, what's in it for the criminalist? In other words, why would they want to get into a room filled with attorneys and subject themselves to perhaps questions on their area of discipline? Well, in fact, there's a lot in it for the criminalists. First of all, it's practice for them in their particular area of discipline. You know, they are listed and subpoenaed into court a lot as expert witnesses, but the reality is they don't often get to testify. So this was actually very good practice. The second aspect was it was great networking. Again, they had an opportunity to meet firsthand with lawyers, present to them, as well as then talk to them at break and afterwards, and frankly get to know the lawyers, both prosecution and defense, in a very different way. And that was helpful to everybody involved. The third aspect, which is something that Jody Wolf was very clear on was helpful to criminalists, is that this helps in their evaluation. In other words, they are actually reviewed on whether or not they have been conducting training. And it is one of the aspects that assists them in promotions. So there's a lot in it for criminalists, and as it turned out, they were very happy to be involved. The next issue we had to tackle was, well, who would be the students? I mean, frankly, at first we thought just prosecution. And for those of you out there that are listening to the fact that the Arizona model included both prosecution and defense and say, well, we just couldn't do that in our state, you know, that's fine. Your model, or if you decide to take on a forensic science academy, might not look like the Arizona model. But there's certainly aspects of what we've done and what has seemingly worked that you may want to take back to your jurisdiction, think about how could you craft it for your own state. But we had some serious discussions, and you can well imagine the kind of discussions we had, including both prosecution and defense. But bottom line, we felt, and frankly, a lot of the grants that are out there expect that you bring all of the criminal justice practitioners to the table on these kind of training issues. I would ask both Elaine and Tim at this point to speak from your vantage point, being part of the first academy. How did you feel about having a mixture? That's not normally how we have actually done training in the past.
Well, I can definitely say one of the things that was very appealing to my decision to commit to such a long training program was the fact that there were going to be people from the defense bar there. The reality is, in the very beginning, I don't know if contentious is the right word, but there was definitely a split between the aisle. The prosecutors were on the right side and defense was on the left side, and it was almost like a courtroom where, you know, you just had that aisle in the middle, and nobody really commingled much. It was very casual, and that was it. As the class we went on, we did go through kind of that group formation stage where we had a couple classes where it did get very heated. I would say the discussions, never disrespectful, but definitely heated. And it was only because you felt like you had to continually try to prove the position that you've always held with regard to whatever the subject was for that day. Now, as the class moved on, though, however, the group really took on a very neat dynamic in that we started to have these open discussions. So it was more so than us just trying to prove our point, why we were right, why we were wrong, why this was more of a science, why it wasn't more of a science. We really found that you started to listen to the other side's assessment of the presenters and of the actual science that was behind some of these experts' presentations. And what you found was, at least personally what I found, was that I really started to understand where some of the defense bar was coming from with regard to some of the sciences that aren't as easily classified as sciences, such as handwriting, obviously bite marks now, where we used to think that was more of a science. So I think that I got a very deep understanding not only of the science and how I could do my job better, but also how to look at my cases and go back and look at my cases from the defense perspective and what they're looking for. And I think it's really made my ability to negotiate and really have some very professional relationships with some of the defense attorneys and the defense bar that I work with on a daily basis.
You know, obviously, beginning it was a little unusual to have joint training. I had been a participant, I think, in some training that the Arizona Supreme Court had done on some capital litigation. That was the first joint training I had been involved in. And it was with a great deal of trepidation, I think, that anybody agreed to participate in that particular amount of training, or that particular training about the capital litigation. Obviously, beginning in the Forensic Academy, I think it was a little bit easier for me to understand and accept that the science teaching that we would do was going to focus on, you know, what these disciplines were able to do, the reasons that they thought they could identify or not identify things, the limitations, and how they can be appropriately presented. And I think that that's something that both sides need to understand equally, have an understanding that would be able then to be presented in court accurately. And that's, I think that both sides getting the same training is actually very beneficial, because everybody's kind of on an equal footing and understanding about the limitations and the value of the science.
So the reality to this discussion is that we really felt that the best model would be to include both. It had its downside, though, and we had to talk about that. It could perhaps stifle discussion. Some people would feel perhaps that secrets were being shared. But in terms of the criminalists of forensic science, the scientists felt that the science is the science, and therefore they were not uncomfortable presenting the science in a room filled with both defense and prosecution. However, they weren't sure how the defense bar would respond to them. So one of the things that both Jody Wolf, who became a co-chair, and I were very careful, especially in the beginning, was to make sure that the attendees understood that this was not legal advocacy training. This was training on forensic science. It was a collegial atmosphere. It was one of professionalism, courtesy, and was to be a non-threatening environment, not only for the students, but for the presenters as well. Judge Weinstein, we certainly wanted to have judges involved from the beginning, and that hasn't always been easy. Do you want to speak to that?
Well, we've used some judges as faculty members. Arizona is a state that recently, beginning of this year, became a Daubert state. And we also changed our rules of evidence, Rule 702. So we've had one of the justices from the Supreme Court speak at one of the programs, one of the judges from the Court of Appeals, myself. We brought in a judge from San Diego, my late friend Woody Clark, who just recently passed away. And we've had judges attend some of the sessions, but we decided that this really was going to be for prosecutors and defense attorneys together. We've held some sessions at the State Judicial Conference on Forensic Science, but the current Vice Chief Justice of the Arizona Supreme Court has discussed with me the fact that for his 5-year strategic agenda, once he becomes the Chief Justice and moves up the ladder, that he really wants to make forensic science training for judges one of the things that he wants in his agenda. And we're going to be working with the Arizona Judicial Education Services Department in that regard. Right now, there's some excellent training nationally from the National Judicial College on forensic science training, but that can only reach so many people. And for this, we really want it to be for Arizona judges and touching on all of our judges throughout the state. And so that's something we're going to be working on.
So continuing on some of the more nuts and bolts and organizational issues for the first academy, we had to consider how long or how large should the class be. Well, first of all, what was the size of the training room at the medical examiner's office? And that could actually seat 50, which was our maximum number for the first academy. But as we continued down that road, and I think we had about 46 in the first academy, we realized that that was a little tight, and it was better to actually, for several reasons, both physically as well as in terms of just the discussions and the opportunities to network, to reduce the size. And I should mention at this time, I'll be talking, and the group, the panel, will talk about that there have been some changes over the course of time. We've run the Basic Academy now a total of 2 times in the last 2 years, and we've been fortunate to also do an additional model, which is the Advanced Academy. So that Advanced Academy was even a smaller size yet because it was extremely detailed and focused on just a few aspects of the science. But the point being that we continue to modify what we think will work best based on the evaluations and just discussions during the course of the actual academy. Going back to the venue then, we felt that the medical examiner's office provided the technology we needed and a meeting room, as well as, frankly, it spoke of science. We wanted everything about this academy to be somewhat different than the normal trial advocacy and other types of trainings that lawyers have gone through. Well, this location just spoke of forensic science, and it made, I think, the attendees feel special and involved in something very different than the routine. We also had to think about tuition. In other words, we all recognize that it really helps everyone to be a little more committed if, in fact, they've put some money forward. But a lot of the folks would not have a lot of money, especially if they had to individually pay it. We started with a tuition of $200, and in all honesty, that covered just the basics of the binders, the copying, as well as the textbook, which I'll get to in a minute. Ultimately, we did change that after the first academy to a tuition of $300 to give us a little more opportunity in running the academy to have some funds to bring in some practitioners from outside the area, particularly in the advanced class. But we also recognize that tuition may be difficult. So thankfully, the executive director of the Arizona Prosecuting Attorneys Advisory Council agreed to subsidize any prosecutor that would go. Likewise, the defense attorneys' offices most often would pay for their tuition. So that worked out very well, and frankly, I don't think there's been anybody that's had difficulty attending because of the financial issue. But speaking of finances, the other aspect, again, nitty-gritty, is you have to have a fiscal agent. So who's going to be the agency that would administer this? There has to be a budget. We have to run the tuition with the checks coming in, and then we have to make some orders and buy and purchase certain things. Because the advisory committee that was the umbrella organization of this is a committee of the Attorney General's office, that is where we ultimately had the administration agency and is the fiscal agent for this. Another aspect that we thought about organizationally was how do we, once we have accepted people into the class, how do we tell them the specific information to get to the first class, how to park, and what's anticipated, what's expected, as well as any changes during the course of the academy. And what we felt was that the chair, and that was me, had to create a group email list, and then I was the conduit or the liaison, if you will, with all of the students. So if they had questions, they knew who to direct them to, and then I would get a response. We already mentioned why we needed tuition. Part of that was because we needed a textbook, and we felt that every attendee should walk away and have a wealth of resources, but one particular textbook that they could always reach to. We reviewed a number of textbooks, and for those of you that perhaps have not done this yet, when you go out there and you look at forensic science textbooks, if you contact the publisher, they will send you a review copy free. This is a good thing because these textbooks are expensive. We ultimately chose the Saperstein book, and we'll have a slide on that at the end of the presentation. His Introduction to Criminalistics, the 10th edition. Perhaps there were a few other books that the lawyers might have enjoyed better, but the reason why we liked Saperstein is it's comprehensive, but most importantly, every criminalist that was going to be presenting, in fact, had a copy of this particular book. So they knew what the class attendees would have as a reference, and it was very helpful that everyone was frankly singing off the same sheet of music in terms of the materials presented.
One thing I'll say about the tuition as well, we're not really funded by any agency. We don't have a budget, so to speak, but the Attorney General's office has been very good about funding outside speakers if we decided to bring them in. I mentioned Judge Clark before. He and Christine Funk, who's a public defender in Minnesota, we brought them in to talk about the legal aspects of DNA presentations. We brought in Glenn Langenberg from the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension to talk about nuances in latent fingerprints. We actually, in this last advanced session, we brought Ray Crone in to talk about his case, as well as his former criminal defense attorney, Chris Plourde from San Diego, who now is also a judge in California. So we have never been turned down by the Attorney General's office on bringing in outside speakers. All right, we're going to talk a little bit now about what some of the challenges and issues that the Academy Board faced, and I'll let Marna lead that discussion and then have Elaine and Tim jump in as well.
Well, so as an Academy Board, and again, this gets back to the planning effort, we had to think of what are the most important considerations in running such an academy. Well, in Arizona, we do require continuing legal education, so obviously we had to be able to support that. Because the academy ends up being at least 11 weeks, 3 hours a week, any given academy provides the opportunity for up to 33 hours of CLE. Well, that's frankly fantastic and much more than any of us need here in Arizona. And when you consider that the current tuition is $300 for that, I don't think it gets better than that. So obviously that was a real draw, and anyone interested in using forensic science in their practice kind of was a no-brainer in terms of they wanted to be involved. The other thing that we were very clear on when we had decided to include both prosecution and defense is that we wanted to provide an equal opportunity to both. So as the applications came in and we reviewed those applications, we tried to make sure that the class was balanced. Well, that ultimately never became a real problem. So we always had somewhat close to an equal balance. We were never out of balance to any extent that it seemed to be a problem. By the way, I'll also mention that for the basic academy, we wanted to have between 3 and 7 years of experience. We felt that somebody that was very new to practicing law and having not used any forensic science, frankly, this would be just above them probably, unless they really enjoy science. So likewise, those individuals that have had years of experience, perhaps they would be bored. As it turned out, we had a variety of experience in the first academy, and for the most part, that really didn't present a problem. In some of the evaluations, some folks felt we were too much in detail and a little bit over their head. Other people felt it was too basic. So I guess, again, we try to go back to providing an academy and having the applicants have some experience, but perhaps not too much. But we really want to be open to anyone who wants to participate. The involvement of judges has been difficult. We always felt that we would be better off for having judicial involvement. And so, and one of the next aspects is we also wanted to have an interactive curriculum. By that I mean that we of course had to have the forensic scientists present on their discipline. But after a few presentations for the first academy, we provided an opportunity for different members of the class to take a case, review it, and then prepare a brief argument on a motion to exclude that particular science in that particular case. I'm going to ask Tim to comment on that because ultimately that didn't seem to work well. At least the attendees didn't seem to appreciate the activity, although you would think that that would provide some great opportunities.
Yeah, I think oftentimes lawyers don't like to do this sort of thing in front of other lawyers. I think that there's some nervousness that is involved in that. You know, other people don't see you in court, don't know what you do, and here you are trying to do something where you might look stupid in front of your peers. So I think that there were a lot of people that were reluctant and kind of refused to participate or tried to hide in the shadows a little bit. I think there were other people who may try to show off a little bit during the whole thing. So I'm not so sure that, you know, this really worked out. And I think that's kind of sad because I think this could have been something that would have been, you know, very, very useful and a very good part of the training, but it's just that I think it's maybe the psychology of lawyers that it just didn't work.
So we continue to reflect on that because I think there might be another way that we could tackle that particular issue that would be more palatable for the attendees and students, but still provide that additional breadth of experience to make use of what was just learned in a particular area of forensic science. It also included judges, and that was one of the other additional great things about it. And I know Judge Reinstein always appreciates when judges can be involved with attorneys outside of the courtroom. Frankly, I think the judges really enjoyed it, and I know the students enjoyed having judges involved. But when we did do that interactive piece, it was a judge or two, frankly, that would come in on each session, and they would play the role of a judge in that particular legal argument. I think it worked out very well in that regard, but we just did ultimately modify that segment based on evaluations. Then the other, of course, important issue were the topics. And so as we're going to discuss in more detail briefly, we wanted a broad range of topics.
Yeah, obviously at the first academy we had topics that really kind of covered the entire breadth of what you might think is forensic science. As it's developed with the academy, the advanced academy has focused really in on three main disciplines, the ballistics or firearms identification, DNA testimony, and fingerprints. But the original academy had all sorts of different forensic disciplines and was very interesting and gave a fairly decent in-depth view of all these different things, which I found to be quite interesting and gave me exposure to things that I might not have normally had.
Yeah, with regard to the topics, I mean, I've found myself to become very specialized in my field, and that is in white-collar crime. So I do a lot of things with fingerprints and handwriting and documents. The problem, however, becomes when I end up with a case that also has toxicology or DNA, and I find myself like a fish out of water. So that was really the other part of the academy that I found appealing was I do have a lot of what we refer to as companion cases, which are cases that just travel along with our field. And I needed to know about toxicology. I needed to know about these things. But the reality is you can go ask somebody in your office, and they can kind of tell you what DNA is, and hopefully you'll catch enough of it to be able to explain it to 12 people. Or you can take a class from an expert who can break it down into something that is easily understandable. So I think the wide range of topics was really important to me.
You know, the one thing that I'll mention before I turn it over to Marna is in speaking to the forensic scientists both at the local labs and the state lab is that they really have been encouraged by participants in both the basic and advanced classes that have contacted them after about specific questions that they had regarding what they've learned. And so I think that's really worked well in developing that relationship and give and take between the lawyers and the criminalists.
So obviously we have to talk about what was the length of the academy, what was the schedule that we adopted. And in the beginning, we looked to what day of the week would work best. In Maricopa County, trials for the most part do not occur in criminal cases on Fridays. Although there are some motions hearings, Fridays tend to be the best day to have people and practitioners available. So we did 16 weeks, 2 hours, running from, I think it was 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. on Friday afternoons. Obviously, in terms of attendees coming from outside Maricopa County, that perhaps would be problematic for them because they might have to drive hours. And in fact, we had in the first class, I think, attendees from at least 7 different counties. Some drove close to 3 hours each way to make the class. But having it midday made that possible for them. Over the course of time, that was one of the things that changed. What we did was we modified our curriculum and we reduced it to 11 Fridays, 11 weeks, going to a 3-hour session. And that was based on evaluations. Another aspect that was really important to us from the get-go was branding, or providing a logo. And we're going to show you the logo that we came up with. We wanted this experience, as I've mentioned, to be very special. We wanted to be distinctive in how we ran this, and so everything that we put out had the logo on it. This was very focused, professional, scientific curriculum, and we wanted every attendee to feel that this was very special. So we came up with this logo thanks to a member of the Phoenix Police Department Crime Lab, and we branded everything we could with this logo. So every binder had it on the spine, on the front. We provided ultimately a coin to all graduates, and it had the logo on it. We wanted this to be just very special. But as I've mentioned a little bit in passing, what has changed over the course of these last 2 years? Obviously, as I've just mentioned, the length has changed and will change again. We'll actually modify at this next basic academy to be every other Friday. It'll run much longer. So I think that's a great experiment. We'll just have to see if the evaluations come back that that was the best way to do it. Again, we're always taking those evaluations. Likewise, we've done away with the interactive aspect. However, in terms of, doing a moot presentation in terms of hearing on motion to exclude. But we're continuing to toy with the idea of how better can we do that, perhaps at the end of the academy when people know each other better, they're less concerned about how they appear in front of fellow students, and we're going to continue to explore that. We've also reduced the class size. That's partially because we've had fewer applicants over the last few years. The people that have really wanted to be involved were involved from the beginning. But we find that a reduced class size really does make for better opportunities for the academy.
Yeah, the last advanced academy that we finished, I think in September, or was it October? Anyway, we had, I think, about 25, 26 participants, which worked out really well. Again, as Marna said, with the enhancement of discussions with a smaller group. All right, for the original planning of the academy, Marna, I know you had a timeline that you had to meet. You want to talk a little bit about that before we get into the curriculum?
Well, just briefly, it took at least 6 months for us to plan how do we do this new thing. We had never done this before. We were doing things in a very different way. So it was about 6 months for planning. The announcement for the academy went out about 3 months in advance. So people could look at their trial schedule, see if it was something that they could commit to. And the commitment was a big issue for us. We wanted to make sure that anybody that was interested in attending would sign off on the application itself to say, I will do my best to attend 80% of the classes. We did not want this to be a drop-in type of training. And we recognize that things happen to trial practitioners. But for the most part, most people were able to make that 80%. And if they couldn't, it's not because they didn't want to. We, about 2 months out, actually provided the acceptance. We received the applications, a few of us on the Academy board reviewed them, and then we sent out the acceptance. Again, we felt that was important so they could make a scheduling commitment. Likewise, another aspect of that, and it's thanks to Judge Reinstein, he spoke with our judges in Maricopa County and made sure that the judges doing criminal practice understood that a lot of the practitioners may have some scheduling issues on Fridays, and they would be sensitive to the fact that we needed them to make the academy. The tuition needed to come in approximately 4 or 5 weeks out. Now this was important because, frankly, we needed to buy the textbooks. That had a longer lead time in order to purchase them, and as I said, they were pretty expensive. I think we were able to get them for $113 a book. So we needed the money because there was no money to run this academy other than the tuition at that time to order the books. The other things, it was not so much of an issue. So that ultimately was our timeline.
Okay, let's move on to the actual topics that we covered in the curriculum, which was intended to be broad-based in the basic academy and more focused in the advanced academy, hitting the various forensic science disciplines. Tim and Elaine and Marna, can you briefly describe the various topics that have been covered first in the basic academy? And Tim, I know you already mentioned a little bit about how the focus has been on the advanced academy.
Well, first of all, and the first class, it was Jody Wolf, and I presented on the scientific method. This is important because as lawyers, we don't always understand scientists. And let me tell you, the scientists don't always understand us as well. One of the most important things, as I briefly mentioned, was that lawyers needed to understand the scientific method, and that there are limitations on what a scientist is comfortable and feel they can say based on their scientific knowledge and in the community of practice that their discipline is in. So we really started everything with an approach of a scientific method. The next aspect was the National Academy of Sciences report. Tim was involved in this particular aspect.
Yeah, as part of the first class, there was a panel discussion. Judge Reinstein was the person who led the panel discussion. Myself, a lawyer who I had presented with before about the report, who's from the Pima County Attorney's Office, and a member from the DPS Crime Lab, all presented on the NAS report and discussed some of the issues that were raised in the report and some of the reasons why the training would be a good idea for all of us to have. Kind of gave us an idea of an overview as to how this should be done.
Timing was everything in terms of our academy in Arizona. As Judge Reinstein has mentioned, we became a Daubert state this past year, and we have been a Frye state. But there were rumblings and clearly some discussions occurring regarding the change and a change in rules, perhaps even in legislation, which came to pass, regarding moving Arizona to Daubert. So we made sure and continue to make sure that we include discussions of Daubert in the curriculum.
One of the first topics that we discussed then after we did the framework for the discussions was the crime scene response units. Obviously, the collection of the evidence that is at the crime scene is probably the key thing that has to occur properly in order for scientific disciplines to go forward. If the evidence is not properly collected, if it's not somehow packaged and stored properly, marked properly, the crime lab is going to have a very difficult time in doing anything with the evidence. Phoenix, in particular, has developed a crime scene response team. They have procedures that they follow. They have ways in which the evidence is collected, the ways it's packaged, marked, and that information was something that we got to learn in some detail from the actual people that work in that unit, and it was something that was very helpful for me because, you know, oftentimes you have cases that have a large amount of evidence, and if you understand exactly how it's packaged, it's more easily understood as to what the evidence is that has been tested and what it means. I'm going to move on to the next topic here, which was forensic biology and DNA. Obviously, this is a topic that has been something that when I began in the criminal system here in Arizona in the mid-90s, I knew next to nothing about biology and DNA. I guess in the last 15 years or so, I've learned quite a bit about it. I know Judge Reinstein was involved a lot in the ways in which forensic biology was brought into the court system here in Maricopa County. Obviously, I think this is, of the forensic disciplines, the one I understood the most, and perhaps in some ways the one I was most interested in having the training from. Many of the people who presented were people that I'd known for a number of years and had testified in court before, and it was good to understand exactly where they were coming from and what they were talking about. And I think even though this was an area that I thought I knew pretty well, I think I learned from the class and was happy that I was able to have that experience.
Moving on, I think another part, as Tim mentioned, when you become a lawyer, you don't necessarily know anything about biology, and so toxicology becomes such an important part of what we do on a daily basis, especially given the fact that so many attorneys start in misdemeanor DUI courts and things like this. And all I could remember thinking as I took the class was, wow, this would have really been helpful 3 years ago when I was trying misdemeanor DUIs, and I was trying to get through blood alcohol content, and I really didn't know what I was talking about. So to have an expert come down and break down toxicology and how they really do blood analysis, and you know, we have so many different motions coming in from defense attorneys, at least from the prosecution side, with regard to manuals and calibration. And, you know, honestly, you don't know anything about that unless you really take it upon yourself to study it, which I didn't do because I didn't have time. So to have somebody come in and talk about toxicology and the science behind it, it was just like the light went on. And, you know, anytime you've experienced that light just going on and going, oh, okay, this is what they were talking about, I think that class alone has helped me immensely in being a trial attorney. Same thing with controlled substances. There's so many times that we're talking about field analysis and things like that, and most of us have never even seen one. So you're trying to explain this to a jury or trying to elicit testimony from a witness, and you don't even really know what you're talking about. So to have somebody come in and talk about controlled substances and the different tests that they do both in the field and in the lab really shed light on being able to take this back and then turn around and explain it to 12 people that haven't seen it either. So I think that was really important.
Firearms analysis was another topic and was a very exciting one, I think, for the class. We often call it ballistics. That deals more with trajectory, so it's firearm analysis, comparisons. That was also a hands-on class and very popular because there were a lot of things to look at in terms of bullets, cartridges, and that sort of thing. We also included resources, and for the first academy, we were able to have a speaker from the National Clearinghouse for Science, Technology, and the Law. This is an organization, and on the board, both Judge Reinstein and I have been able to serve since its inception. The National Clearinghouse for Science, Technology, and the Law is the biggest database available to any of us on all things involving forensic science. So they also were able to provide some information in terms of how do you actually research a discipline that you're going to have to litigate.
And we then got to the friction ridge analysis classes and the question document classes. Those obviously I do high dollar fraud and Ponzi schemes and stuff like that, but there's also a lot of times that we have search warrants, and I think every practitioner, be it defense or prosecutor, has to deal with friction ridge and latent prints, either to prove up priors or to, you know, in a burglary, in any type of check cashing. I mean, fingerprints become such a very basic and necessary component for our practice. Now, before taking this class, and I use my friction ridge example every time I tell somebody why this whole class became so important. I didn't really know. I mean, I knew that fingerprints were unique, and then I knew there was something about ridges and circles and stuff like that. But I really didn't know what I was doing. I actually now, in my trial cases, use the presentation, a very shortened version of the presentation that the expert used during the class. And I pull up the fingerprint for the jury, and I put it on a big screen, and I have the expert come down and show the markers, And it really brings to light my evidence. It's more than just a fingerprint. You're teaching somebody, and that's really what we're doing with juries is we're teaching them what we're talking about. So the latent print class, it was my favorite, even though it's not as sexy as firearms or trace ballistics, which I had a lot of fun with. But the latent prints became so important. The question documents did as well.
Another one of the topics that we handled in the basic class was death investigations. Obviously, I've handled a number of cases in which the medical examiner testimony was important. That death investigation information was very helpful for us to know what the medical examiner was trying to say by using certain language, what conclusions they were drawing, how they documented those conclusions, and it was something that I think was very helpful for any practitioner to have an understanding of.
One of the more interesting and very contemporary issues involved digital forensics. This was something that, again, I think most people that were involved in the academy really enjoyed. And we're talking about computer forensics, digital forensics, which really is so much a part of so many of the cases we're now involved with. Our instructors came not from the actual crime labs of the Department of Public Safety or the Phoenix Crime Lab, but our computer forensic experts, mostly law enforcement, are housed in a separate facility that is a shared facility, so about 8 different law enforcement entities have their computer forensic analysts located there. And they came in and spoke to us, and their cases involved certainly white-collar crime, homicides, drug prosecutions, and they were able to talk to us about what the digital world really means and how we as lawyers have to understand it, and of course how we have to then try to present it to a jury. One of the additional aspects in digital forensics is cell phones, and that, especially in drug prosecution cases, which I did a lot of, there are always cell phones being used and a lot of interesting data there. All of us as practitioners need to understand better what that data is really saying. We also included cell tower tracking, which was just very interesting and informative, and we spent a lot of time in the Advanced Academy on that particular topic.
Yeah, not to talk about Marna's topic, but I love the digital forensic presentation and the things that they were able to show us that forensics can tell you about cell phone locations based on cell tower information. And obviously that was something that is going to become increasingly important in cases. One of the things that we did was a team presentation. The team presentations didn't work out quite as well. I think there was a lot of people that were uncomfortable in doing it in front of other people. There was some just concerns about actually having to do some work, because I think that was one of the concerns. It was something you had to prepare for. So I think that the team presentation was something that consistently, if done properly, could really be beneficial, but something that we've dropped from the program so far.
Elaine, we've talked a lot about the presentations and the give and take during the sessions, but I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the hands-on and tours that were done by the classes and the opportunities provided by the laboratories.
Absolutely. And that was one of the really unique things about this whole academy, was that it's not only do you sit in a lecture for 2 to 3 hours and have somebody speak at you, which I know as much as we all love, at times you find yourself spacing out. The reality is that this academy, you were consistently looking forward to, what are we going to get to see next? We got to go down to the crime lab, and the crime lab, I don't know how the organizers made this work, but it was such a remarkable experience to go down and have they let us play with some of the ballistics and show us how they put together the bullets, and they had big virtual bullets. They were big ones, and we were trying to put them together and look at the trace analysis. We also went down to one of the police departments, and they showed us how they do crime scene evidence reconstruction and the evidence lockers and things like this. So to be able to do these type of very hands-on tours became so informative, and it really solidified what you were learning in the classroom. aside from that, we all had the opportunity to go view an autopsy. Now, since I do so many document crimes, that would put me a little bit out of my realm of experiences, but I'm not going to be doing document crimes forever. And to be able to put on my resume that I've seen an autopsy, that I've taken classes in forensics, gets me to a place professionally where I can move to a different bureau and I have an advantage over somebody else because I've seen an autopsy. I've taken classes on ballistics, and I've done tours of the crime labs. So for anybody that is trying to create this type of academy, one of the biggest selling points is that, you know, we don't all get this training because we get so pigeonholed in where the type of practice that we do. But if you want to expand out, or you want to move out, or you want to start your own practice, you get this experience that you wouldn't normally get.
Just as an aside on the autopsies, we've had several judges attend autopsies so that they understand more when they're in trial on homicide cases, what actually goes on. And in fact, one of the justices for the Supreme Court went with me one day and viewed 3 of the autopsies. And the great thing about it is the medical examiner in Maricopa County, Dr. Fiscione, is a great teacher, and he, while he's performing the autopsy, he also talks about what he's doing, answers questions, and the like. Okay, Marna, you want to talk a little bit about materials?
Okay, just briefly, one of the things to think about are your materials. And we really wanted to provide, again, not only the textbook, but a good resource binder for the practitioners for their future use, even if it's a discipline that they had not yet tackled. So what we did was we were able to get from the NDAA, the National District Attorneys Association, the predicate questions that they published years ago for prosecutors. Additionally, there were some articles and publications that we included, as well as a glossary of terms. The point I want to make in terms of your materials, we had to get permission to republish a number of those. So we've kept that permission in writing, and we make sure that all the attendees know that the binder of materials cannot be republished because it is protected materials. But that does provide everybody a working body of knowledge for the future.
Okay, now looking to the future, we talked about the fact that we have done 2 basic and 2 advanced academies. We're getting ready to do the 3rd basic academy in January, and as Marna pointed out, we're going to move to doing every other Friday to make it a little bit easier on some of the attendees and see how that works, and which is better, the model to do every other Friday or to do every Friday, you know, in terms of getting it finished earlier. Another thing that we've talked about on the Academy board is having an academy for limited jurisdiction attorneys, prosecutors and defense attorneys who do a lot of DUI work, and having it focused on those unique areas that we might not be able to spend as much time on. And I'll have Tim talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, one of the ideas that we had tossed around was that in the future we'd like to do an academy that would focus on DUI, perhaps some blunt force trauma evaluation, and some testimony concerning taking pictures of these sorts of things. Because, you know, there are quite a few people who practice almost exclusively in limited jurisdiction courts, you know, city courts, justice courts, both prosecutors and defense attorneys. And this would be a market that I think there would be a lot of people out there that would like to take the classes and learn about these things and learn about these in depth. And I think that particularly like the Mesa City Prosecutor's Office has asked if that would be something that we could do in the future.
One other thing we wanted to do is provide something for the forensic scientists. So we've now started a forensic science speaker series. We did 3 in the spring, and we're doing 3 now in the fall. They've included, we brought in national speakers, ethics in forensics. We did one on uncertainty of measurement, one on DNA mixture interpretation. In our fall series, we started out a few weeks ago with Dean Gialamas, the former president of ASCLAD, who now is the director of the LA County Sheriff's Crime Lab, and he talked about leadership in forensics. We've got sessions coming up soon on emerging drugs and bath salts, which is a real issue here in Arizona, and also validation of ABI's 3,500 genetic analyzers. And we've had great attendance from forensic scientists for those sessions. We also are planning for, as I said, judicial training and working closely with the Vice Chief Justice of the Arizona Supreme Court, and we'll be working with Judicial Education Services on that. One of the benefits that I've seen from this is an increased comfort for our forensic scientists in dealing with legal issues and dealing with attorneys, as well as an increased comfort for attorneys in approaching scientific issues and being able to talk to the forensic scientists. Now, we listened to the critiques. Marna talked a little bit about it, and Tim did as well. One of the things I'd like to have maybe Tim and Elaine address is the student responses that we've had.
Well, obviously, I think I can talk about this from a couple of different perspectives. Obviously, I was a student in the class myself, and I really enjoyed pretty much everything about all the classes. I think everything that was done in the academy that I attended was top-notch. I think I learned from everything, and I really appreciated the opportunity to be involved. So I have my personal experience. I can also speak to some of the things that now that I'm on the board that I've heard people, either complain about or indicate that wasn't particularly helpful. I mean, I know one of the things that we had done as part of the development of the Advanced Academy was to focus in on the 3 disciplines that we thought might be the most useful 3 disciplines for people handling more advanced cases. Obviously, as crime gets more serious, it usually becomes more violent. So the disciplines that we focused in on was the identification of firearms, DNA, and the fingerprints. There was some digital forensics that was also tossed in there, but those are things that I think that we do. The evaluations, we get the evaluations back from them, and we've done some changes to the curriculum based upon what the students have said. But I think overall, at least the evaluations I've seen have been all pretty positive.
I don't have the unique experience that Tim has of seeing both sides, but I did give an evaluation or 2. So I definitely think that hands-on, if somebody were trying to create a program like this, one of the most important parts to making this program successful is the hands-on portion of it. Also, the fact that we had different speakers coming in every week, you get a unique perspective, and you're kind of waiting to see who's going to be the next one rather than just having the same lecturer talk from a textbook. I think that is critical. I know we've heard a lot about whether or not the group projects and the group presentations work or don't. I like group presentations. I think it gives you a chance to sit down and really talk to each other. However, the caveat I would have is we started doing group presentations right when the class as a whole began to merge together. And what the group presentations did was created them to, again, separate, because you just look, I think part of Tim's right, you're uncomfortable, and so you look for some comfort, and the people that you look for are the people you work with. So if group presentations are going to become part of a program, the possibility of having random assignments, so you're forced to do that group presentation with somebody you're already uncomfortable with. So, everybody's uncomfortable across the board. I think that would help. But the other part is, I know Marna had mentioned the textbook. I think the textbook has been wonderful. I use it as a reference tool today, and I took the first academy 2 years ago. So having a great textbook, having hands-on, and really making this class something different than what you can go find at any CLE. The model that they have created has been amazing, and it's really something to follow.
We talked a little bit about expanding into into some web-based courses for people that don't find it that easy to come to the Phoenix area. Arizona is somewhat unique in that about 60 to 65% of the population, and therefore 60 to 65% of the lawyers are in the Phoenix area. We have talked about having a Southern Arizona Academy based out of Tucson. We've had discussions with the head of the Tucson Crime Lab, as well as the Pima County Attorney's Office and the former Pima County Public Defender on that, and that's one of our hopes to be able to do that. But Tim?
And one of the things, obviously, on that regard is that we're going to try to somehow get ourselves in a situation much like this webinar where perhaps we can broadcast to people that are in the outlying counties. As Judge Reinstein has stated, Arizona is way out of balance, and pretty much everybody lives in the Phoenix area. but there's a lot of stuff going on in the outlying counties, and there's long ways to drive to Phoenix for that. And I know in the first academy we had a few people that drove in from Kingman and some of the far out areas, but that's really hard for people to be able to pull off. And so if there is a way that we can expand the training just to allow people to attend maybe at remote locations and view what we were doing on the web, that would be something that we'd hope to do in the future.
Okay, well, that's, I think, about all that we have to say today. Now we'd welcome any questions, and hopefully technologically we can get some questions from you. It may be that we'll have to get them from Maria and Amy and see whether or not it'll show up on our screen here. But as far as any future questions, we've given you some contact information for myself and Marna. If you have any questions that you want to email to us, but if you have any questions now from what we've given you today, feel free to ask them.
Hi, I'll jump in here. This is Amy Wickman from GMI, and I'm fielding any questions that come in. And so if anybody has any questions, there is, I believe, a column for questions on your webinar page. So feel free to enter questions there. As for right now, we've only received one earlier in the webinar, which I think Marna might have answered, but we'll ask it again. It was, can you repeat how the textbook may be obtained?
Yes, the Saperstein textbook, I'm not recalling, and I don't have the information in front of me, the publisher, but if that person would be interested in emailing me, and that contact information is up there now, I will give you that. I have that available. I can also give you the names of some other publications. And again, you contact the publisher. Often on their website, you go to where it talks to teachers, and you're able to request by email or by letter a review copy. So that's one that you don't have to pay for, and that's really very helpful. We probably reviewed 5 or 6 different textbooks, but ultimately we were very comfortable across the board with this particular book for the reasons I stated before. So please, if you will email me, and I'll be glad to give you that publisher and contact, as well as any other text that I still have available.
For those of you who are looking for more resources, Marna mentioned before the National Clearinghouse for Science, Technology, and the Law. That's accessible at www.ncstl.org. It's a great resource for those of you who have not used it before. Also, DNA.gov has some really great programs on there. It's got the Prosecutor's Notebook. It has DNA evidence for officers of the court. It has DNA for the defense. And I believe also Law 101 for forensic scientists. So prosecutors can access DNA for defense. Defense can access the prosecutor's notebook, and I think that's really invaluable to see, what other people are thinking on the other side. Another thing that you can look at is Mitch Morrissey, the Denver DA, has a great site. And if you go into their site, he has case law. And lots of current information, particularly in the DNA area.
And I was just going to follow up on something Elaine had said earlier. I've used that textbook several times in my practice, and obviously when people come to ask me questions, we get the textbook out sometimes and read it, and I've been able to use that to answer questions of other lawyers in my office. So I think the textbook was a really nice addition and something I've used over and over again.
And for those of you who are judicial or prosecutor or defense trainers, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to develop a relationship with the crime lab, and how the people at the crime lab, they want to be seen as just speaking to the evidence, and that they're not prosecution-oriented, not defense-oriented, or anything like that. I know in looking at the list of attendees, there's a couple people that I know. I think Stephanie Stoyloff from the Miami-Dade Crime Lab is online, and I know Cecilia Kraus from the Palm Beach Crime Lab is online. And in talking to them and knowing them, I know that they really encourage lawyers to ask questions of them, and would be a great resource for anybody. Amy, do you have any other questions?
Sure, we've received a few more. Another one is accreditation and/or certification discussed in the Academy?
That's actually something that we were going to have as our initial topic this next time, as part of some of the things that we had previously discussed. We're going to add in accreditation and certification as one of the things to be discussed, and what that means, and what steps have to be taken in order to do that. So that's something that we're going to have a specific topic on that we're going to cover in the next Academy.
One thing I'll say about that is our next meeting for the Arizona Forensic Science Advisory Committee, we're bringing in Jill Spriggs, who's the director of the of ASCLAD, to talk about those issues as well.
And accreditation of crime labs was discussed also in the beginning session of the scientific method. So again, we were trying to educate lawyers in terms of what the crime labs really had to do, and the rigorous requirements for the accreditation. And in Arizona, our crime labs are all accredited, so we're very fortunate in the resources we have here.
Great.
Amy?
Yep, so here's another one. How many total academies have been held since the onset of the program?
We've had 4 academies, 2 basic, 2 advanced. The 3rd basic will start next month. And as I said, we've had the 6 sessions of the Forensic Science Speaker Series.
Great. Thank you. Okay, 2 more. What role can or should prosecutors have in ensuring that the most current best practices are used in the collection and analysis of evidence, which is the responsibility of police, forensic labs, etc.?
Well, I mean, obviously the prosecutors have a great deal of responsibility in I guess, not making sure that it happens, because the reality is that's up to the police and the crime labs and the different agencies. And honestly, rolling off of the topic about accreditation, that's really part of their accreditation, is making sure that they're handling evidence correctly, tagging it correctly, following the proper methods to make sure that nothing is tampered with, and that they're getting the right test results with all of the all of their different things that they're using. Now, I can say, though, just having the relationship with some of the people that I have met through the academies, I know we talked about it a little bit earlier, but to meet face-to-face with some of the people who will be testifying for you was a great experience, because you can really garner for them how they're handling evidence. And the reality is, what you get is the idea that the evidence is the evidence, and we're not going to testify for you one way or another. We're just going to testify about our results and how we properly handle everything to get to that result. I met one of our handwriting experts through the academy, and I use him regularly in my cases now because he's been able to show me how he follows the different methods, and really I find a lot of comfort, and I feel that he is very knowledgeable what he's doing, and he takes it very seriously. So because I know that he's following the proper methods, that makes me feel comfortable putting him on the stand. I've never been in a situation where I have somebody that I don't feel comfortable putting on the stand as a scientific expert, and I never would. So I think our responsibility really comes in making sure that the people that you are putting on the stand, you are confident in what they're saying, and that they followed the correct methods to get there.
Also, if I could just mention on that aspect, I think it would be hard for any individual prosecutor on an individual case to be talking and telling a forensic scientist how they should go about their practice. However, I think the whole idea of a prosecutor and, of course, defense attorney being better educated and having a better relationship in talking with experts provides a better opportunity to have some more of perhaps those difficult discussions. But in terms of best practices, the attorneys do need to be educated and discuss with the experts. One of the things that the criminalists always say to attorneys, and Jody Wolf is very clear about this in our academy, is please talk to us. Please, lawyer, call us. Let's talk about the report and what you anticipate we're going to be able to say in it before the trial. And it's truly amazing how that still doesn't happen enough, and the criminalists want that. In terms of changing any best practice or making sure that any entity is honoring the best practices that are out there in the discipline, I think those discussions have had and are best served at the actual Forensic Science Advisory Committee that Judge Weinstein chairs.
Amy, any more?
Yep, the last question is more for me and Maria, and that is about the availability of the webinar materials, the PowerPoint and the audio. And I can answer that they will be available on the JMI website shortly following the webinar. Our website is www.jmijustice.org. And I believe that is our last question.
Okay, well, again, for those of you listening, thanks a lot for sharing your time with us today. And again, if you have any questions, you know, again, you can either contact Amy or Maria at JMI that she's just given you, or Marna or I. And if you have specific questions for Tim or Elaine, we can, if you write either of us, we'll direct those to them as well. Thank you.
Ron,
yeah.
Can you hear me? This is Maria.
Yeah.
There might be one more slide with contact information. I'm not sure if it's on that PowerPoint. Yeah, there's a couple more contact points. And I just wanted to say to you all, to Judge Reinstein and Marna and Tim and Elaine, thank you so much for your information today. You guys your commitment to refining a meaningful educational experience for practitioners is really inspiring. And I hope that some of the folks listening today will be able to take some of these ideas and adapt them locally. And I did want to say on behalf of JMI, thank you to everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
And I think that's it.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Maria,